Clear prop.
Star 73, Yankee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear Sutton. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and designated pilot examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
I'm doing great. This week is another system, probably the most important system. This week we're going to talk about engines, or maybe commonly referred to as the power plant. Wally, you fly a lot of different planes at a lot of different schools and a lot of different places. How important to you is the engine, and what do you think about when you think about said engines?
Well, yeah, the engine is pretty doggone important, and I'm just going to plug a future episode. In fact, I'm going to let you plug it, Bobby. Why don't you made the contact, so why don't you tell our listeners who we're going to have on our show here in a couple weeks?
Yeah, so we reached out to Mike Bush and SavvyAviation.com. He is going to join us on the show in a few weeks, and we are going to have a great systems conversation, hopefully a part one of many parts and visits from Mike Bush. If you're not familiar with Mike Bush, Wally and I would refer to him probably as the only famous mechanic in the world, maybe.
Probably so,
as it relates to aviation. So we can't wait to have Mike Bush on the show. If you haven't listened to any of his stuff, lots of books and lots of other podcasts and things, but we can't wait to have Mike Bush on the show, and he'll probably teach all of us more about engines and things we need to learn. But we are excited to have him, and we're excited to start the conversation this week as it relates to the power plant.
So we're just gonna scratch the surface on engines here, and when we talk to Mike, we're gonna get much more in depth on engines. But I'll just tell a little story. When I was looking for a 6-place airplane several years ago, I came up with 3 categories, and I first of all I set a budget. I said, okay, I want to spend this much money, or I don't want to spend more than this much money on an airplane. And I went through and I said, okay, I'm going to look at airplanes. I'm going to look at paint and interior as one area. I'm going to look at avionics as another area, and I'm going to look at the engine as another area. So I wanted an airplane that had good paint and interior, good avionics, and a good engine. And I quickly found that the budget that I had set, that I was not going to find an airplane that put a check mark by all 3 of those. I could get good paint and interior, I could get good avionics, but I was going to have a very high time engine. Or I could get a mid-time to low-time engine with good avionics, but it needed paint and interior. And the one thing I did not want to do when I bought an airplane, I didn't want to buy an airplane and bring it home and immediately put it into the shop for a prolonged period of time. So what did I do? I upped my budget, and I found that airplane that met all 3 of the requirements. But I think when we look at airplanes physically, when we see an airplane on the ramp, the first thing we probably see is the paint, and that's the first appeal to it. Wow, that's got a really nice paint job. And I'm not talking about an exotic paint scheme. I've seen airplanes that are white with black numbers, and I can look at it and say, that's a really nice paint job. It looks good. It's good paint, or it's not chipping or anything, that kind of stuff. So I'm not talking about a fancy paint scheme per se. I'm just talking about a good paint job. So I think that's the first thing that we look at. And as I don't know about most of you listeners, but I know what I do is I'll walk up to an airplane and I peek in the window, and the next thing I probably see is the interior. I go, oh wow, boy, that's got nice leather interior. It's got the logo on the headrests of whether it's a Beechcraft or Piper or Cessna or whatever, Cirrus. And then the next thing I do is I look up at the panel and I go, oh wow, yeah, it's got a nice whatever system in it. And we forget about the engine. Most people, obviously you're not going to go up to a stranger's airplane, open up the cowling and start looking at the engine. But the fact of the matter is, I've flown many airplanes that have bad paint jobs, and they fly just fine. I've flown airplanes that have very dated avionics, and they fly just fine. Probably the most important thing of those three areas that I mentioned is the engine, and it's probably forgotten. I mean, a bad engine is going to probably result in a bad flight. So,
no question.
Something that we need to think about, and a high time engine doesn't mean a bad engine. Mike Bush is going to talk about this a lot in a couple of episodes. I think I know many of his webinars that I've listened to. He does talk about flying airplanes beyond TBO, but then I'll let him talk about that. But obviously, without an engine, airplane's not going to fly. So it's probably the most important.
No question. And so I think the understanding of it is key, and that's really what we want to try and help everybody with today. And I think there's varying needs of understanding, but as a private pilot student, you need to understand what's going on, what's creating and producing the power. I joked with Wally before we started recording, I can remember memorizing the first 2 paragraphs of the POH about the description of the engine. It's a Lycoming, it's an opposing engine, but I didn't really know what any of that meant. I just knew that if I got asked in my check ride oral, I needed to be able to talk about the engine a little bit. And that's probably where most of us are at. And if you're beyond that, great. But I think as I became an instrument pilot and I obviously bought a flight school and learned more and more, I understood the importance of understanding what's going on, because there's a lot of, I guess, points of redundancy, but those create points of failure. And
Right.
Those points of failure don't mean that you're going to have a really bad day. It just means you need to understand what to do about that point of failure and how serious is that point of failure. And I think the better and smarter you get, the more confident you get as a pilot, the more you can take on as a pilot in the cockpit, understanding what's going on. So let's talk through those things at a really high level. We're going to talk about the basics for a little bit. There's a lot of components, and so if you think about all the things under the cowling, there's obviously an engine and the components that make up that engine. There's a case, which is the true poured block of that engine. And there's cylinders and there's pistons and there's valves and push rods. There's a whole bunch of components, but we're going to assume that camshaft and crankshaft and all that stuff's put together, and we're not going to talk about each of those individual components today, because that could go on and on and on. That would be an engine's class, not necessarily a podcast. And then on top of that, or around that engine, there's a lot of other things, and we've done episodes on some of those, like the ignition system. And that ignition system has magnetos and spark plugs and wires and a starter and a ignition switch. Whole separate system. We've done shows on those. There's, you could say, the electrical system, the vacuum system, the exhaust system, the heater system. All those are kind of tied into and around the engine. Not necessarily what we're going to dive deeper into today. We want to talk about really what makes that power plant create power, and how do we diagnose if we have a problem with said power plant. So let's jump right in. I think the key is that those pistons inside those cylinders are going up and down, and they're creating power, right? And most of what we're talking about, or really all we're talking about today, are the common general aviation 4-cylinder Lycoming engines that are out there. Now, I guess one thing I'll diverge to here is these are really, really basic engines. These, you put a 1978 Cessna next to a 2020 Cessna. One's probably carbureted, one's fuel injected. The engine's probably really similar underneath the quote-unquote hood.
Yeah.
You put a 1978 Chevy pickup truck next to a 2000 Chevy pickup truck, they're going to be very, very different.
Absolutely.
Why? I mean, hopefully we all know the answer, but why are they so different, Wally? What's kept one back from the other?
Well, with a car, I mean, we've got all kinds of computers in there, and computer, I don't know,
monitors, engine systems, everything.
Yeah, and airplanes, and again, I keep referring to Mike Bush because he's going to talk about this a lot. You know how airplane engine technology has not advanced near as much as car technology has advanced. The technology of most aircraft engines today is probably 1940s technology.
Yeah, and the reason, the short answer, in my opinion, for all that is the FAA.
Yeah.
It's the regulations.
Yeah.
Cars spend a lot of money too just to get the regulations covered. But I mean, I'm not sure it's faulting them because they're trying to keep us safe. But the FAA, it is so freaking hard. You look at the non-regulated, the experimental aircraft that are out there. They've got newer, better stuff.
Right.
But you can't train in them. You can't have there's lots of regulations around an experimental aircraft, but that's for avionics and engines and all that stuff. But they're pretty similar over the last, 40 years. Those engines are going to be identical in Cessnas for the most part. No question.
Yes.
And so those 4-cylinder engines that are super redundant and have all of the great capabilities we need to stay in the air, is why they haven't changed, and then regulations is why they haven't changed. But there's 4 strokes, so that cylinder goes up and down in 4 strokes to create power. And I guess without visuals here, we'll talk kind of a little bit of what's going on inside of each cylinder. Think of a round cylinder. At the top of that, there's 2 spark plugs that come from both magnetos. We've had a show on that. And as that cylinder goes down, there's 2 valves also at the top of that cylinder. One valve opens, and then the piston goes down, and it pulls in the air-gas mixture, the air-fuel mixture that we would have in that aircraft for that day. And as it comes back up, it's creating compression. It's the compression stroke, which takes all that and makes it get into a really small area. And then the 2 spark plugs, assuming both magnetos are working, fire, and they send that piston back down, which is the power stroke. And then as it comes back up, the other valve opens while keeping the other one closed, which is the exhaust valve, sending that exhaust out through the exhaust system. And so those 4 strokes are happening simultaneously in all 4 pistons, cylinders, and that creates the power, which turns the crankshaft, which then in turn turns the prop, which creates air to move the aircraft, right?
Right.
So hopefully we did a good job there without visuals. But if you think about the engine, the cylinders are opposing each other, so they're kind of pointing out sideways. And that kind of helps with the balance and the torque and all those things that are going on. And they turn that prop, which continues to make power. But if you think about there's 4 cylinders, each of those 4 cylinders are simultaneously at a different stroke of those 4 strokes. One's creating power, one's creating intake, one's creating compression, and one's creating exhaust. And they're going really, really fast, right, Wally? This is not something, while on a YouTube video you might see them happening slowly, they're happening really, really fast. If you think that the crankshaft is turning at 2,300 RPMs per minute, I had to do some math there, but that's a lot of strokes per second.
Yes, absolutely.
So, it's really, 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 really turning.
And so, the designation of the engine. Let's take an O320. That O in front of the 320 actually means something, and what it stands for is opposed. It means the cylinders are opposite of each other. Those letters in front of an engine designation, there's 4 that we, probably 3 that we see a lot. Sometimes we'll see an IO in IO 360. Well, what does the I stand for? The I stands for injected. In other words, this engine is fuel injected. So right off the bat, I know I'm not going to have carburetor heat. I don't have a carburetor, so it's a fuel injected engine. And then you may see a T, which means it's turbocharged. My Saratoga has a TIO 540, so it's a turbocharged, fuel injected, and opposed. So those letters actually do mean something. So in an airplane, when we have a rough running engine, it is probably because the engine is essentially out of balance, per se. One of the cylinders is probably, or one of the pistons inside the cylinder is probably not firing or moving like the one on the opposite side is, and that's probably what's causing the airplane to run rough. So we see this on mag checks where we go out and we're doing our run up and we shut the mag. We shut one mag at a time off, and essentially we're shutting half of the spark plugs, one spark plug from each cylinder off. So if we have a bad spark plug, maybe one cylinder is not performing properly. That's why we get the rough running engine, because basically the engine is out of balance.
So you mentioned there were 4 letters. The other letter is S. That stands for supercharged.
Right.
Probably not going to see that at your local flight school anytime soon. I'm just going to call that out. But there is a 4th letter there, and it's S. So talk about, you said 540. Most of the 172s on our flight line at the flight school here is all have 320s. So what's the difference between a 540 and a 320, and what do you think of when you hear those numbers?
The 320 is the displacement. It's 320 cubic inches, and a 360 would be 360. It works out to where the horsepower of the engine is usually about half of the displacement. So an 0320 is usually 160 horsepower engine, or about.
Yeah.
Now, in the case of my Saratoga, it's a TIO 540. Half of 540 is 270, but it does have a 300 horsepower engine. But that could be attributed to the turbocharger. Adds a little bit of extra power. But an IO 360, most Archers, Piper Archers, have an IO 360, maybe an O 360, 180 horsepower engine. So you can get an idea of what the horsepower is by just looking at that designation.
So we talked about the 4 strokes in the engine. We talked about the identifiers of those engines. You probably, I assume, during private pilot check rides, ask your candidates questions about the engine. What are you looking for in their understanding of an engine? If you could share with us a little bit, not necessarily exactly what the answer needs to be, but what are you looking for as it relates to their understanding of the engine or power plant?
Yeah, I'm going to ask them questions in a scenario-based situation. I may ask them about if during the run-up you had a rough running engine, what would you do? And of course, the easy answer and what most people give me is, well, I'm going to taxi back in and have a mechanic look at it. And I go, well, okay, you could do that. And I can't say that's wrong. But I say, well, let's say you're at an airport where you don't have that available to you. And usually the next thing is they say, well, I'll cancel the flight. And so what we try to get into is at that point we'll talk about how many cylinders we have in the airplane and how many spark plugs we have in the airplane and how many magnetos and what's actually going on inside that engine. I don't get super involved in things, but I think it is important that we kind of know what is going on inside the engine and the reason why the engine is running rough. Why is the airplane running rough right now?
So they don't need to be a mechanic, of course.
No, absolutely.
They need to
not.
have some knowledge about it.
Yeah.
Reading the POH, I assume, is probably good enough, and being able to articulate some of the components of that system.
Yeah.
Common problems. We start a lot of engines. I would say the biggest thing that people struggle with is the starting of the engine. We at home probably start our vehicles every day and never have any trouble. And when we do, it's very unlikely we're going to pop the hood and figure it out on our own nowadays.
Right.
Maybe when I was in high school that was possible with a little bit of trip to high-low auto parts, which doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
But today in an aircraft, there's 12 on my line out there. They're all probably going to start multiple times today. People struggle starting aircraft.
Yeah.
Why do people struggle starting aircraft?
Well, one thing versus your car is most cars are going to have nice electronic ignition systems, modern ignition systems. And in these airplanes, literally, we have 1920 technology. For most of these airplanes, we have magnetos, and we don't have a nice electronic ignition system. That goes to and some airplanes are going to an electronic ignition system, and the experimental airplanes, most of them probably have it. And so there's a lot of push and pull with the FAA trying to get them to allow us to use more of electronic ignition system. That's an argument for another day, and that's again something I keep referring to Mike Bush, but something he's very, very passionate about is an electronic ignition system. So that's part of the problem is just the ignition system, and by definition, the ignition system is what ignites the engine, right, and keeps it running. The other thing is a lot of these airplanes have carburetors rather than fuel injected, so that's another maybe more complex system of mixing the fuel and air.
Yeah, so there's really three types, I guess, of starting an engine: hot, cold, and flooded. All should be referenced in your POH for the type of aircraft that you're flying on any given day. But we're talking generalities here. A Lycoming 360, 320, four-cylinder opposing engine in a Piper or a Cessna product is probably going to start fairly similarly if it's carbureted or it's fuel injected, based on a hot, cold, or flooded start. Meaning, fuel injected one type of problem, carbureted one type of problem. Most commonly, lesson after lesson after lesson, these engines are hot or very warm from the flight prior to, and we think of a hot start quite a bit. So a hot start is much harder in a fuel-injected aircraft than it is in a carbureted aircraft. And I think that has to do, if you read your POH, it probably talks about it, but the heat vaporizes that fuel in the fuel lines going into the injection system. And you really have to try and start the plane with the mixture knob pulled all the way out and just a little bit of throttle. And really what you're doing as you're cranking that engine is clearing that vapor out of those lines to then get fuel to get to the cylinders and vaporize there. And probably the common mistake is too much of that red knob pushed in while you're trying to start that aircraft that's a little warm or hot. And then the carbureted engine is probably easier to start when it's hot, but you just don't want to over prime it at that point, right? You put a whole lot of fuel in those cylinders, you might flood it. We'll talk about that in just a second.
Yeah.
We just went through the coldest time probably ever in the city of Houston. Both experienced our own woes as it would relate to water, broken pipes, and frozenness in the area. Not a lot of flying going on. But, man, cold starts. My maintenance manager gets real agitated real quick because they try and they try and they try and they end up taking all the juice out of those batteries.
Right.
Any tips for a cold start?
You know, when I got my Saratoga, the guy that sold it to me, we went out, we flew it for about an hour, and he said, "Okay, well, here's how you start it." We got in, and it started right up, and so I was flying at home. We had to make a fuel stop on the way home. And I got back in the airplane, and that airplane would not start. I was doing it the way he told me to start it. And then I finally got smart. I actually pulled out the POH, and I did the procedure in the POH, and the airplane started right up. So that's where I would start, is start with the POH. It seems kind of ridiculous that I'm having to say that, but I would look in the mirror and say I was guilty of trying to come up with another way to start it, and the POH works in my
That's
airplane.
why the maintenance manager is always upset. He's like, they come in, the battery's dead, they need a jump, and he's like, "Did you read the POH? Do you know how to start a cold engine?" I mean,
right.
It's right there for you.
Yeah.
It's not going to be like last Saturday when it was 90 degrees.
Yeah. And I know in my airplane, the Saratoga, it is a big bore engine and it is fuel injected. Cold starts are actually fairly easy. Well, they're very easy. If I shut down the airplane for 5 minutes, I can get in and it's not a problem to start. Where I kind of run into the problem is the time when it's shut down for about 45 minutes. And what's that? That's a fuel stop. That's you're stopping somewhere to get fuel. You go in, you use the bathroom, you pay your bill. It's usually about 45 minutes, and that's the time that it's taken me a couple years, but I'm pretty good at getting the airplane started. But it's kind of embarrassing when you're out on the ramp trying to start the engine, and the line guy's standing in front of you telling you you're clear to start, and you're saying, "Well, I'm trying to start it. It's just not starting."
So on a cold start, I think the tip, again, look at the POH, but it's probably harder to start a carbureted engine. As you said, a fuel-injected engine, probably fairly easy to start when it's cold, but a carburetor engine is more difficult. And the reason for that is the fuel-air ratio, or the mixture, and what that really needs. So very dense air needs lots of fuel. And
Yes.
the common mistake might be over priming in that situation, but it is probably an art. You're probably not going to get it if you have 5 hours of flight time, but a little bit more fuel and a little bit more mixture, or you're really trying to get that mixture balanced to where the engine can start. So if you don't prime it excessively, then you need to probably take some of that mixture out. And there is a setting on the carburetor of the fuel air mixture that's set, that you really can't change unless you change the throttle characteristics. So you might have to have a little bit of throttle and a little bit of mixture out, and it becomes this science. But if you can think about, am I putting enough fuel in that cylinder that's getting some spark with the dense air today? That's really what you're trying to get to on a cold start to get that engine to fire up on a carbureted engine. Flooded start. We've all been there. We've probably all flooded an engine in our days. On the flight line. So the engine becomes flooded. The answer simply, again, is check your POH, but probably most Cessnas and Warriors call for the engine, the fuel system to be set up as much as having a completely full throttle and a completely mixture pulled out, or no mixture, I guess would be the words. And what you're going to do is start cranking that engine, and as it starts to start, you're going to take and pull the throttle back and push the mixture in, which is going to get the balance just right. And that never made sense to me, which kind of brings us to the last topic. What are these levers controlling? What are we doing? So when I have the throttle fully in, it's not called the fuel. I'm not pushing the fuel all the way in. I'm pushing the throttle all the way in. So on a carbureted engine, I'm really opening that damper valve, I guess, at the top of the carburetor that lets that fuel air ratio flush itself to those cylinders, right? So,
Right.
And that probably, if you looked it up, it's probably 1 to 15 parts. 1 part fuel, 15 parts air. It's flooding through the carburetor, right? The throttle's wide open. And so I'm sucking in all that air and all that little bits of fuel, and then based on the mixture, the red knob, I'm able to control. What am I controlling there, Wally, with that red knob? I think a lot of people, it's called the mixture. Is it air or fuel or a combination of both? What am I controlling with the red knob?
You're controlling fuel with that red knob.
Yeah, so it is the fuel amount that is going in that cylinder. So I think I've heard people reference it as, I'm controlling the amount of air. That's not the case. You're leaning at 3,000 feet and above in most cases, because the air density is less up there and I need less fuel. So as I back out that red knob, I'm backing out the fuel that's going into that system or those cylinders. So if I have a flooded engine, I want the throttle wide open and I want that amount of fuel going in there to be less. So I pull the red knob out. And I think just a little bit of learnings like that will make you a much better pilot as well. So I hope we've helped explain the engine, what's going on in the engine, what the 4 strokes are, what some of the letters and numbers mean around the engine. We can't wait to, if you've never met or listened to any of Mike Bush stuff, introduce you to Mr. Mike Bush and Savvy Aviation in a couple of weeks. Anything to wrap up, Wally, as we wrap up today on engines?
No, we're good. Just don't forget about that engine. Some of the older Pipers have cowlings that you can actually open up in a pre-flight, and I so wish we could do that on more airplanes, because most Cessnas, you got a little thing that we open up and we reach in there and can't really even see, but we reach in there and pull out the oil dipstick and maybe drain a sump, but we don't really get a very good look on it. So my encouragement would be to when you're at your flight school or at an FBO and they've got an engine on cowl, go out there and take a look at it.
Yep. That's a great point. My mechanic at this airfield would love for people to visit and look inside cowlings. Every time my twin is in a 100-hour or an annual, I love to go down there while it's on jacks and the seats are off. You can watch the gear and all the things going on. Like, there's great opportunities to do that, but you're going to have to be proactive. There's never... You can't be ever too smart on systems as it relates to these aircraft, and there's always another aircraft that you can learn something about a system that you're not familiar with. So go challenge yourself, get to your mechanic, and check out some of the things that are under the cowling and under those seats. You'll really become smarter and a much better pilot as you do so. As always, thanks for listening. Please share with a friend. Please give us 5 stars wherever you listen to podcasts, as we have earned it. And as always, stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.